Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to the EU Democracy Reform Conversations, a series of online events organised by the EU Democracy Reform Observatory, which is a joint initiative of the Bertelsmann Stiftung, the European Policy Centre, the King Baudouin Foundation, and the Stiftung Moderator to foster debate on modernising European democracy. My name is Jacki Davis. I have the privilege of moderating this series, and as always, it will be a totally interactive session with questions from me and from all of you as we discuss Europe Reimagined, exploring European reform options. I'll introduce our speakers in a moment, but housekeeping first, your microphones are muted. If you wish to ask a question later on, you wish to speak, please click on the raised hands button and I will unmute your microphone when the time comes. If you prefer to write your question, please use the Q&A box, not the chat, the Q&A, and please be very brief so I can see at a glance what your question is and who it's for. If you would like to engage with social media, I can't say tweet anymore, can I? So engage with social media. The hashtag is Democracy Reform Conversation. So we're going to focus today on why do we need to reform the European Union at this critical juncture in our history and in a world of escalating tensions and conflict. How ambitious do we need to be if we are truly to make the EU more effective, more democratic and ready for enlargement? And where do we go from here? What are the key next steps, both ahead of the European elections and looking to the longer term after those elections and into the new EU legislative cycle, if we are to deliver the necessary change? I am delighted to welcome Guy Verhofstadt, MEP, who is a member of the European Parliament's Constitutional Affairs Committee. He was co-chair of the Executive Board of the Conference on the Future of Europe and one of the co-rapporteurs of a new European Parliament report on EU treaty reform, soon to be voted on in plenary. Delighted to welcome Daniela Schwarzer, member of the Executive Board at the Bertelsmann Stiftung and a member of and co-rapporteur of the Franco-German Working Group on EU Reform and Enlargement, and Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies at the European Policy Centre. So as I said, totally interactive. We're going to jump straight in. And Guy, if I could come to you first, just to set the context for what we're going to discuss. Why, from your perspective, is it so important that we focus on this question of reforming the EU now in the face of all the challenges that we are up against at the moment? And how ambitious do we need to be?
Well, I think that everybody will understand that in this new world order in which we have jumped since the brutal invasion by Russia in Ukraine, and also with the perspective of a further new important enlargement of the European Union, where we will create a union of, I don't know how many, 34, 35, 36, maybe more member states, that it is impossible to continue with the way the governance we have now in the Union. We see that already a few years without the enlargement. Already with 27, it is nearly impossible to take decisions in a number of areas. We see that, for example, in the whole question on sanctions, for example, to Russia. The impossibility of the Union now to decide on a 12th sanction package. That's already months that it is on the table. Why it is impossible? Because of bad governance, the fact that you need unanimity for such an issue. For years, we were not capable to solve, to have a common point of view on migration because of the same rule. In the meanwhile, we have problems inside the Union. One of the member states certainly not complying with the principles and the values, but we are not capable to really push them in the right direction, to sanction them in a convincing way. And at the same time, we see that the world order makes it necessary to do a number of efforts in issues and on competences that we don't have on the European level.
How ambitious does this reform need to be? I mean, should we be focusing on what is pragmatic, what is eminently doable, or do we need to push the boundaries here?
Well, we need to push the boundaries because what is so-called pragmatic doesn't work. A typical example of a pragmatic instrument that we have in our treaties that exists since the Nice Treaty is the passerelle clause, the possibility to use a passerelle to go from unanimity to qualified majority. But it has never been used because you need unanimity around this. And we will never use it. Why? Because small and medium-sized member states will never allow to use the passerelle clause because you come in a system of qualified majority in which you give, in fact, more or less a veto to France and Germany. That is what is happening if you use qualified majority. So this so-called pragmatic way doesn't exist, or if it exists, he's stuck to the pragmatic way. You cannot come out of the pragmatic. So therefore, an ambitious reform is needed based on the outcome of the Conference on the Future of Europe. And what I see the last weeks and the last months is that there is convergence. You have the French-German paper with starting from the same philosophy as the work we do. We have voted our report, 200 pages of treaty reform in AFCO, in the Constitutional Affairs Committee, and it will be voted in the November session in plenary. And then there is an agreement with the Spanish presidency that they will put it in the beginning of December on the General Affairs Council to send it to the European Council before the December summit.
Let's come back on that process in a moment, if we might, Guy, and what the prospects are, and also delve into a little bit of the detail, not all 200 pages, but a few headlines from your report. But Daniela, before we do that, the Franco-German report does talk about being ambitious and pragmatic. Guy, they're saying not possible to be pragmatic. We need to just push the boundaries now. From your perspective, we'll come into the detail of the report in a moment, but why now? Why is reform so important from your perspective? And how ambitious do you believe we need to be?
I think we know enough about the geopolitical pressures that lie on the EU and its neighborhood, the internal challenges that the EU has, and then, global power shifts, the loss of European competitiveness in comparison, to have very strong arguments why we need to seriously think about a stronger European Union. In order to bring stability to our neighborhood, I think the best possible option is to push forward with the enlargement agenda as the most ambitious and the most important option. And the European Union at this point is not ready for enlargement. It needs to work, and Guy Verhofstadt has just said that. It needs to work on its own functioning. And we as a Franco-German working group, we actually agreed, yes, this has to be done before enlargement happens, but it actually has to be done in any case, because the European Union needs to be stronger, it needs to be more ready to act. It needs to defend its fundamental principles, such as the rule of law, in a better way, and not just because 8 to maybe 10 countries will want to be members of the EU, hopefully in the near future, but because the European Union needs that. So I think, setting out the why do we need to reform, this is pretty obvious. And I do see a strong development in the way this debate has evolved over the past year. When we were asked to join this expert group last December, this was like a kind of a vision project, like, Franco-German experts starting to work on getting the EU enlargement ready. And when we first presented our preliminary thoughts to the General Affairs Council in June, we needed to explain why at all enlargement should happen and the EU should prepare for enlargement, and why both have to go hand in hand. When we then tabled the report in September, the debate had already changed in a very important way. So the question then was not are we moving ahead with getting enlargement ready? But the debate was far more in the area of, is Lisbon enlargement proof or not? Do we need to aim at treaty reform, or can we just twist and tweak a little within the existing treaty framework? We as a group take a very clear position here. We say whatever is possible should be done based on Lisbon, because of course treaty change involves ratification risks, just like enlargement does. And so whatever can be done within the existing framework should be pushed ahead with, because it's beneficial, because it can improve the functioning of the EU, because we can do a lot in partnership with the accession countries before they become full members, not to build an alternative, but simply to extend EU policies and their very positive influence in terms of stabilization, economic cohesion, and many other aspects to candidate countries. And we should also think through how we can involve them in decision-making processes, of course, without giving them, because that's not possible on the current treaty base, giving them a say in decisions. No, but having parliamentarians be involved, having representative of accession country governments involved, having citizens involved. You know, the debate about participatory democracy in the European Union is important, and it can be extended to the candidate countries.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to hear from both of you some of the headlines from your reports, but Janis, just in terms of your reaction to what we've heard about, I think we've set the context for why we need the reform, but this question of ambition, pragmatism.
Well, first of all, I think already years ago, I remember we were at some point talking about the need to be pragmatically ambitious or ambitiously pragmatic. And if you compare the situation some years ago with where we're now, we definitely need to be more ambitious. And already the basic rationale of why this is the case with the world around changing. I would also add the challenges which we're all facing in light of the poly transitions which we need to deal with, which are not only geopolitical, geoeconomic, but also green, digital, demography. These are all things which were there already before the 24th of February, before the aggression against Ukraine. So I think what we've seen and what we now need to be aware of is that obviously the pressure to reform the EU has mounted compared to where we were 1.5 years ago. And thankfully, there is now more of a consideration that there is a need to change the European Union. Daniela was already alluding to what the situation was in December of 2022, and that there now is more clarity for the need to reform the European Union. However, I must say that already in December 2022, we should have been aware that there is the need to reform the European Union. We should have understood maybe probably earlier what the Zeitenwende means, and actually it's a global Zeitenwende. It is something which affects not only Europe, but the globe. And if you look into the situation in the Middle East, and if you look at the different links between what is happening there to not only the role of Europe, but also towards how we're changing globally. So the need to reform now is obvious. The question is how far we will go. What actually we mean when we talk about reforming the European Union. We already were starting to discuss whether we're talking about treaty change or not having treaty change. I think we will not be able to do it without treaty change. We will need treaty change. The question is what kind of treaty changes we need. And I'm sure we're going to discuss about all these details. And may I just add one point? I'm not fully sure that we will be able to reform the EU the much we need to reform it in one go. Who is to say that we will be able actually to reform the EU to be ready for 34, 35, 36 in one round? We might need more than that, which also means not only do we need to be ambitious, but we also need to push in terms of not wasting time. There is no waste. There is no time to waste. We need to actually be ambitious also when it comes to how we will conduct the process of reforming the European Union.
Thank you very much. Guy, let me come back to you. And indeed, your report does focus on, it's a proposal to amend the treaties. So you're very clear in the title of the report, where you fall on this line of, I think also there are things you suggest can be done without changing them, but what would you highlight as the most important elements? And it really will have to be a snapshot in the time we have.
Maybe to explain to those who follow us, what we do is use Article 48 of the treaty, existing treaty. So Article 48 gives the possibility to the European Parliament to indicate what articles of the treaty need to be changed and how to change them. So it's and then to send this request to the European Council. The European Council can decide with a simple majority to organize a convention so that work and that discussion can start. It's important to tell those who are following us that it's one of the lowest thresholds in the treaty to start a convention, a simple majority. But that's a process that is foreseen in the treaty. So what we and therefore we have had the obligation to indicate how we want to change. So we have a very concrete proposal. Not that we think that that will be the end game, but it's to open the discussion and to give the possibility to the council to say, in my opinion, it would be best that such a convention doesn't start immediately, but starts after European election. Why? Because you will have a new composition in the European Parliament, you will have a new commission, and so therefore I think it would be good to start by the end of 2024, once the new institutions and the new majority in the Parliament and also maybe changes in the Council are in place. And then third element, you say, what is the main thing? There are a lot of things. If you want, I can speak now for 1 hour on all the articles and why this is necessary. But the main problem that we try to solve is naturally a problem of governance of the Union. The sticking unanimity in a number of areas will make it impossible to take action, or if we take action, we do it too late and too soft, without, as we have seen in a number of areas. And therefore, to get rid of unanimity, certainly in a union with 36 or 37 member states, we change the idea of qualified majority in the institutions in the Council, so that you need more member states to agree. So we're proposing a 2/3 majority of member states as qualified majority, and we create what we call super qualified majority for a number of issues like going to war, taxing people. That are the two things for sovereignty: soldiers and tax civil servants. So if we want to go in that therefore you need a special super qualified majority, as we call it. And we think, so it's a little bit the same reasoning as in the French-German paper, who also ultimately is ready to change the way qualified majority is working today. But that's one, I would say, colonne vertébrale in the report. It's not the only thing, because we want to limit the Commission, for example. Another thing that Baerbock a few days ago has proposed. We wanted to change Article 7. We want to create new competences, health union, for example, European Defence Union, because in Europe. We are spending a lot of money with 27 on defense, as much as China, in total, but we are not capable to do 10% of the operations of the American army.
We have a proposal, I think, for a European-wide referendum mechanism.
That is also foreseen in the proposal.
What sort of issues do you envisage it?
That you cannot ask for a referendum that is in contradiction with the basic values of the European Union. So it is and secondly, we for the rest, we didn't specify, oh, you can do it on this, or you cannot do it that. You cannot do it on. You have to respect the values and the basic principles. You cannot go ask for a referendum against these principles, against these values. And then there is a whole procedure, naturally, also involving that you need a majority, not only a majority in general, but also a majority in every population of a majority of member states, so that a double threshold. So that is one of the proposals, besides other ways of citizens.
All about making the EU more effective, more efficient,
more
able
efficient,
to take decisions, able to take decisions.
Well,
and
yeah. Look, if you see by the beginning of the war, when we needed to take some action, for example, a ban on import of fossils from Russia. Well, yeah, how it works in America. In America, the American president, Mr. Biden, takes a presidential decree, and he says, okay, in 2 weeks now, it's over. No one liter, and with us, it has taken 3 months, and then it has taken again 3 weeks to implement it, and it is not fully a ban. It's only by the end of the year that it will be fully banned. So things like that are the consequence of our governance. So I know, I agree with those who are saying policies are more important than institutions. That's true. But my point is that bad institutions create bad policies.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there for a moment. Lots to talk about. But let's now hear, Daniela, from your perspective, the key points, and I'm not going to ask you to say where it is similar to the European Parliament's report. Janis has been doing some work on comparing the two, so I'll ask him to do that. What would you highlight? You were the co-rapporteur of the report. What would you highlight as the most important elements?
Yeah, I think I'd like to highlight 3 points. One is that the more we worked on the issue, the more central the issue of protecting the rule of law within the European Union was to us. And eventually we decided to open the report with that chapter. Why? Because first of all, it is probably the issue on which the EU failed itself most over the past years, of not being able to use the mechanisms and not being able to realize that it doesn't have the necessary mechanisms to make sure that individual countries don't violate those principles. And this is not about only disciplining member states to comply with the values and principles they signed up to when they became members of the EU, but not abiding by the rule of law principles actually endangers the single market. So it's about protecting a common European good. And I do believe that we now know more than probably ever since European integration started, that the single market and the economic base of the EU is really one of the big leverages the EU has globally when it wants to be an international actor that co-shapes rules and protects its own interests. So this is a fundamental issue. And here, of course, we encounter a big problem. That is, how can you reform a mechanism with unanimity if you are actually doing it to discipline member states? And that's why we make 2 proposals. One is we recommend to use the budget even more than is currently the case, because the way conditionality has been introduced into the Next Generation EU Fund is really something that has worked, that has been able to exert some influence on countries that didn't get the money. And I think it's a practice that should be adopted for the multi-annual financial framework, not only because it is a leverage, but also because we are going at some point to face a problem of legitimacy if the EU is not able to protect those principles and not able to do this when budgets are spent. This will create problems on the net contributor side of the budget, because citizens will rightly ask themselves, why are we contributing our taxpayers' money to fund activities in countries where those principles aren't met? And secondly, we do make a proposal to change Article 7 in a way that it can be more effective, but that would, of course, require treaty change. I think to get support for this only works, as for many other reforms we propose, if we think about a bigger package deal that eventually all member states realize that they have a collective interest to move ahead with the European Union. And if on this principle they are not ready to do so, this is going to be a moment of truth for some countries who may actually have to then ask themselves, if we are not able or willing to fulfill the fundamental standards of being a member of the EU, or maybe we then need a different way. Second point, differentiation. Yeah. If the EU grows to a size of, let's say, 35 countries, maybe more, there will be more countries, more governments, be more diverse interests. And given the geopolitical context, the economic context we have all described, it is obvious that capacity to act is one fundamental issue. And it's not only something specific to the EU, it's very natural in a group of 35 to forge a consensus on a new policy to adopt or a new thing to do. It's going to be difficult. So if you have a need to act, you need to be able to do this in small groups. We say that, of course, as we all know, the Lisbon Treaty provides some interesting ways of doing this with enhanced cooperation, and wherever possible, differentiated integration within the EU should work based on treaty law and based within the EU institutions. We do say that if groups move ahead, there should be an exclusion clause. The countries that move ahead can decide from the start to work with qualified majority voting within that group, within that policy.
Daniela, we can't really delve into the detail of it, but as you're saying, you say it needs to be done, you set limits to where it can be done as well. The third element?
Yes, the third element is decision-making. And here I don't think I need to add much to what he said. Changing the voting rights, bringing in more QMV, and changing the balance between large and small countries is something that we put forward, as he has said, and that, you know, in a way shows you that we have worked as an independent expert group, because it's definitely not at first sight in the interest of France and Germany to have a weight which in relative terms is reduced compared to the smaller countries. But we do think this is a concession that needs to be made to get support for introducing QMV. And we also make some suggestions which may be a little technical, but the basic idea is to protect national sovereignty in key questions that countries can sort of highlight where they feel a very particular national interest is touched. And then a deferral of the decision can be made, for instance, to the European Council.
Thank you.
The whole thing about QMV, and I'll close with that, is it's not only about changing the decision-making rules, but it's also changing the discipline among member states, because if you have the mere option of going to vote with QMV, actually consensus building may get easier because countries or their representatives may be more ready to move, because QMV and being on the sort of losing side is nothing that anyone really wants. So the perspective to forge a compromise may actually be a better one.
Thank you very much, and sorry to hurry you. We've got so much to cover and so little time, as they say in the cliche. Janis, briefly, if you would, in terms of how aligned these two reports are. As I say, I know you've been doing some work comparing the proposals in each. Where are they very much the same? Where are they different? And do you think they're covering the most important elements?
I think, first of all, that they do cover the most important elements, but as always, the devil lies in the detail. And at the end of the day, you will need among the U27, as Daniela said, a package deal. Now, the question is, how do you get there? This will be the complex political exercise in front of us. But if you ask me about the similarity and differences, let me mention some structural similarity and difference. First of all, we mentioned that already, but I want to highlight it again. The basic rationale which is behind both reports, the EP report and the Franco-German report, are very similar. And I think it's important to highlight that, because it's not the case when you talk to everyone in the EU, when you talk to all representatives of EU governments. So even though, yes, in the case of these two reports, they're very similar, but the rationale among others and other players are very different. And when it comes to structural differences, we already mentioned the fact that the EP report comes up with concrete treaty amendment proposals. It offers a concrete text of what needs to be changed. Guy was already mentioning 200 pages. So it is very detailed and very broad. There's a strong reference to the Conference on the Future of Europe, which, by the way, Guy already made. And I think this is important because I think we sometimes underestimate the role the conference has played in this process. I'm not saying it has been the key decisive factor, but it also played a role to be in terms of its pressure function. Obviously, the EP calls for a convention. It is also stronger when it comes to EP prerogatives. It has a strong emphasis on the role of the European Parliament, which is natural. And I would also say, and I know this is very superficial, but it is more federal if you compare it to the Franco-German report. So here maybe is where the pragmatism comes in the Franco-German report, which, by the way, is more, it has also concrete proposals, don't get me wrong, but it also has some more fundamental aspects of recommendations and it also defines some principles. If you look, for example, in enlargement, or also with respect to different. Now, in terms of concrete similarity and a rush, I think it's important to highlight that strengthening, reforming, refining Article 7, rule of law protection, is something which is very strong in both reports, and I think that's important. The extension of QMV, we already talked about, but also the extension of the ordinary legislative procedure, so co-decision with the European Parliament, the extension of that is in both reports. MFF for 5 years instead of 7, strengthening citizens' participation, defense union, all these are things which are in both reports, but again, the level, the detail, the devil lies in the detail of what actually needs to be done in order to. And then let me just mention some concrete differences. Bear with me for half a minute. The European Parliament report calls for a right of initiative for the European Parliament. It calls for EU-wide referenda, which we already talked about. I think it calls for an extension of exclusive and shared competences. The G12 report has elements like, for example, calling for a rotating presidency of a quintet, no longer a trio. It's calling for a potential not only reduction of the commission size, potentially also for a hierarchical model of the commission, also when it comes to voting rights, if some commissioners are not having a voting right. When it comes to the EU leadership, the EP report says we need to reverse the roles of the Parliament and the Council when it comes to nominating Commission President. The report of the Franco-German Group is calling for an interinstitutional agreement on lead candidates. I could go on. Also, when it comes to the entry into force of treaty amendments in future, there is a difference. When it comes to IGCs taking decisions, there's a difference between both reports.
Okay, but I think
so there are differences, concrete, but also some more structure.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Lots of questions coming in, and many of them relating to the politics of all of this and the political prospects for actually achieving these reforms. Daniela, you mentioned, well, you can tell this is an independent report because one of our suggestions wouldn't really work so great for France and Germany. But let me read a couple of the questions coming from our audience. Ari De Pata says, how do you intend to win over reluctant member states to give up their veto rights that would seriously limit their power and influence? Yes, it would make the EU more efficient, but I'm not sure whether these member states actually want the EU to be more efficient. On the other side, Karina Stratelat says, why would smaller member states agree to renounce unanimity in favour of QMV or some other form of majority? Wouldn't their concern re the loss of influence to France and Germany hold in any other formula, other than unanimity? How do we get the member states on board, asked Stefan Schreck. So many questions about the politics of this and the feasibility of it from a political point of view. Guy,
I explained. So these questions have already a little bit got an answer a few moments ago when I explained that if today you want to abolish unanimity to fall back on qualified majority as it is today, it will never happen. And all the questions that you received are influenced by that. So, naturally, it's impossible. That's the reason why the passerelle has never been used. It exists since the Nice Treaty, the passerelle. We invented it in the Nice Treaty. I remember it around the table with a good dinner with Chirac and said, we're going to do it with the passerelle and that will solve the whole problem. And it has never solved any problem. So, the point is also in the German French paper and in our proposal is you need to change qualified majority in favor of small and medium-sized member states.
The question is, how are you going to convince member states to do that?
No, that's the point. They can be convinced if there is an increase in their position of small and medium-sized member states in qualified majority. Okay. If their position in qualified majority is strengthened and it is not longer a de facto veto of France and Germany, then it will happen. I can tell you, I got 4 co-rapporteurs of Germany in my so it's not only backed by a lonely Belgium, but there is a common understanding that if you want to do something on unanimity, you need to change qualified majority as it is now by increasing the role of small and medium-sized member states, and secondly, by what we do, creating a super qualified majority for very important issues like taxation, like for actions, military actions, of a European defence.
Thank you. Daniela, on the other side, the status of this report, you've underlined it was independent, but it was commissioned by the French and German governments. What's their reaction to it been?
Yes, well, first of all, we got a mandate and we worked within that mandate, but all the proposals we made, the structure we gave, it's the topics we highlight at their respective weight, that was really our decision. And what we can see is, first of all, none of the two governments has taken a formal position on the report as a whole. And that's not surprising at all, because they want it as an input into a broader European and trans-European debate, which is happening as we speak. So the resonance is enormous, the reactions we get, the reviews. So this has worked out, and eventually the two governments will form their positions. We can see, for instance, in some of the recent statements, we see similarities. Are we the cause of those statements? I don't know. But Macron last week suggested to enhance probability in the European Union, and he suggested an institution to fight corruption in a better way. This is something we suggest. If you look at what some German politicians say about, for instance, rule of law issues, or the question of participatory democracy and involving candidate countries, the German Europe minister picked up that point very deliberately. The push for, rethinking how to introduce more QMV. This has been a position of the German government when it held the EU presidency on, in particular, foreign affairs. And now this debate is kind of getting a new dynamic with new questions raised about the feasibility. And here comes the proposal that Guy has mentioned and ours, which suggests how you can possibly win over others. So I think the reactions are overly positive. We did not expect the governments to endorse the full report, and we didn't write it for that, actually. We had an explicit conversation with the two Europe ministers, and we said, look, if you want an independent report, this will go beyond what is feasible from a German and French government perspective, and that was exactly the base upon which we worked. I think we see that the debate is definitely more dynamic. I think we hammered in the fact that enlargement and reform need to be thought together, and that we have a very strong imperative to move on both. And so I really hope that the December summit will be ambitious. And unfortunately, the Commission President wasn't in her State of the Union address, that the reform of the EU should not just be within the framework that the Lisbon Treaty sets, but we need to also tackle the big questions of how the EU is future-proof, including the treaty reform.
Lots of questions about the Spanish presidency, the Belgian presidency. We'll come back on those in a minute. But Janis, in terms of the political prospects for getting agreement, we've talked a lot about that growing convergence. But there are also some very strong holdouts. We talked about the small member states. We've talked about the biggest member states, but there are many in between. How do you see this playing out?
Well, I think it is extremely important that we have this momentum now. The fact that we have the report from the Parliament, that we have the Franco-German report, the Group of the 12, it is important because it actually pushes the debate not only in a certain direction, but it pushes us to have this debate against the background of what we were talking about earlier, a changing world around us, near abroad, but also at the global level. So it's extremely important that we have this discussion. There is momentum. You can clearly see that there is momentum. By the way, also, if we take up certain proposals which are older than the ones which are included in the report, it's also fine. The question is, what are the next steps? And actually, what is the way how we get to the package deal? Let's not also forget that there will also be an exercise from the Commission with respect to the pre-enlargement review process, looking also into policies, which I think we should not forget in terms of the need to also reform policies in order for the European Union to enlarge, and that there will be also linked to the discussions we're having with respect to institutional reform and governance reform. So when we talk of the package, also of the question of how do we make sure that we get all member states on board, which is a pressing need to do so. And I guess we're going to talk about more details in a minute. But I think one needs to have these dimensions and think all of them together. Also, the next EU budget will be something that needs to be thought together. But at the end of the at the end of the day, it's about, what's the extent of reform, which reform, how ambitious are we, which method are we going to use, what is the political process in the upcoming months and then years, and we need more clarity on that. I'm not sure whether we will get to a point where the European Council will agree to say, let's start a convention and let the convention deal with it. I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
Because just one sentence. In our last democracy reform conversation, we had the Swedish Europe minister, and she was saying we need to make the EU more efficient, we need to make it more democratic. But then colleagues were referring, and also a member of the European Parliament, were referring to concrete proposal, what needs to be done. So after having said we need a more effective, efficient union, a more democratic union, when it came to the concrete proposal, the answer was, no, we don't want that, no, we don't want this, no, we don't want that, and so forth. That shows you exactly where we are and what we need to overcome to reform the European Union. In this room, virtual room, we all agree, but outside, there are many who still disagree.
I'll come back to the key next steps in a moment. I just want to very briefly touch on two questions, and then, as I say, lots of questions about key next steps coming in. I'm going to take some more written ones and try and get a couple of raised hands in as well. But Guy, two questions to you, really. First of all, differentiated integration. Daniela referred to it. Does your report touch on it? And if it does, what does it say about it? I mean, the Franco-German report says, yes, we're going to need it, as Daniela made it clear. There are limits, there are areas where we can't have it. What's your view on that, briefly, if you would?
We have it already in the treaty, so
Indeed.
enhanced cooperation
Going
exists.
further. Yeah.
But we don't change the rules on enhanced cooperation. We see the advantage of it, to use it, and so on. Concerning the question, look, at the end of the story, there could be, I don't know if everybody agrees in 27 member states to change the treaty, so good. But it could be that at the end there are a huge majority in favor, but there is maybe a small minority not willing to go forward. And there you could also say, is it not necessary then to make a new treaty? With those who want to go forward. So that is something that I see maybe happen at the end of this exercise.
And one other question relating to the Conference on the Future of Europe. Janis mentioned it earlier. You were co-chair of the executive board. How important is it? How important is it that do you see your report, the Franco-German report, has it taken account of what happened at the Conference on the Future of Europe? And what's the consequence if the public feel, those who took part in that process, feel that what's happening now has got nothing to do with what they did?
No, it's the opposite. We would like, in fact, to organize, we are discussing this in the European Parliament again, a new debriefing towards the citizens that were involved in the conference. We did already last year. It was very difficult for the council to explain where we are, but I think what we did in any way, we can also document that, is translating nearly all the proposals by citizens that need a treaty change, naturally. And there are a number of proposals by the conference that don't need any treaty change. That can be done by an initiative of the Commission or by a decision of the two legislators. But there are a number of proposals that need a treaty change, and all this has been taken on board in our report, so that we can say this is the report that you need to fulfill the recommendations of the Conference on the Future of Europe.
Thank you. And one of our audience, Daniela, says, how can civil society stakeholders and citizens be continuously included in the reform debates? Guy spoke a little bit about that earlier on as well. Is this an issue that you touch on in the report?
In our report?
Yes. No, sorry, to Daniela this time.
Sorry.
So.
Yes, we do. And we actually go beyond the limits of the European Union, because we say that, if enlargement and reform, they are the two big issues that not only the EU needs to tackle, but also the accession countries need to deal with. We suggest that some instruments of participatory democracy are extended to candidate countries. Not everything, but I think in some cases this can have an important effect of, of actually buy-in.
Citizens as well, citizens
Yes.
who took part in the Conference on the Future of Europe, who may
Yes.
feel this has now become a process that is happening independent of their discussions, and why did they bother?
Well, I think, the main thing about any element of participatory democracy is that the EU institutions need to be dealing more seriously with the results. And also, if there's something as big as the report of the Conference on the Future of Europe, it is extremely important to make clear where this goes, which elements are being picked up, what the next process is. And of course, we can all find it, but it could be made more explicit to appreciate this exercise, which was important as such. And also to look, it's not about reinventing new instruments, but it's looking at what we have, what has worked, how it can be extended, maybe even more in the digital space, and how it can be used beyond the EU's border, and how then policymakers commit to actually be more serious in dealing with the results thereof.
Thank you very much. Let's take this graft of questions. Janis, 1 minute if you would, and then please, you can have a quick one.
Yes, two quick, 10 seconds the first, the 15 the second. First on, I remember when we were talking about, this was in the nascent phase of the Conference on the Future of Europe, and we were saying we need to involve representative citizens also from the future member states when we talk about the future of Europe. And at the time, we were told, mostly from the council, we cannot do that, it makes it too complicated.
I agree.
So that shows you the limits of thinking sometimes. With respect to differentiated integration, yes, we already have a differentiated Europe. We're probably going to need more differentiation. The question is it the silver bullet? And here I would be a bit more cautious in terms of my response to that question. Which one is political? Which member states are actually ready to jump into deeper integration? Look into the debate we had on Eurozone reform. So even those countries who are part of the inner circle, as you call it, I think the inner circle, Daniela, in your report, even those countries have not been ready to reform the EU. So would they be actually ready to jump into the deep? I have my doubts. And second, there is a lot of need for unity. And when you look at the political situation after, given the war in Ukraine, we're talking a lot about how unity is significant. So we also have to be careful not to create new dividing lines in Europe. So yes, we have a differentiated Europe. We need more differentiation, but I'm not sure that it is the silver bullet. I think we need to go through the difficult hustle of getting to a compromise. The question is, if we have 27 minus X, and the X is very small, Guy, if it's very small, how do we deal with that situation at that point in time?
Okay.
Like the Americans, it's 1786.
Okay, let me come, and these are really questions, I think, for you, Guy, about the Spanish presidency, the Belgian presidency, and where we go from here. Joe Lynon says, if the Spanish presidency does not deliver, you've said they've agreed to put it on the GAC agenda for December, but if they do not deliver, is Belgium, says Joe, equally committed? What can Parliament do if nothing happens till the elections? Then we have another question about, on the reform timeline, as a former Belgian politician, what do you expect, hope for from the upcoming Belgian presidency in the context of this discussion? I think that was it in terms of, but so basically, in terms of where we go from here and the role of the presidencies in this.
Yeah, but so like I said, in the last meeting of the Constitutional Affairs Committee, the Spanish presidency, represented by the Minister of Foreign Affairs and European Affairs, committed to put, if we vote in November, so because if we don't vote in November, then it's not possible. But if we vote in November, the question immediately on Co-Rapporteur and immediately on the General Affairs Council, so to be ready for the European Council. And what I then expect, so if that is the Spanish are doing that, is that the Council gives to the Belgian presidency the task to prepare an initiative. Ultimately and ideally that will be naturally to prepare a convention that then will start by the end of 2024 once we have got elections and once we have a full-fledged commission in power. That is also a good timeline. Why? Because then during the election, the future of the union becomes a key element of the whole electoral debate. So what union we want? Therefore, that seems to me an ideal timeline. And my impression and information that I have is that the Belgian presidency is ready to take up such a task. So based on what the Spanish presidency is preparing for the European Council of December, to then further work it out during their presidency in 2024.
Very quick follow-up, if I might, Guy, just linked to something Daniela said about Ursula von der Leyen's State of the Union speech, where she said, you know, there wasn't much reference to this. If the council, you mentioned this being an election issue, post-election, if it seems that the Commission and Council are not giving this the priority that you are urging, what should the political consequences of that be? What can the Parliament do?
Two things what the Parliament can do. The first, what the Parliament can do is go to court. Why? Because it's not the first time that we have done a request on Article 48. We did it already, just after the end of the Conference on the Future of Union. So you could go to court because there is no time limit foreseen in Article 48 of the treaty, but the respect between the institutions makes that they have to respond to it. So if they don't respond in the next months to it, then Parliament could decide to do that. And the second, what is in my opinion even more important, next year there are elections. There will be a political majority coming out. There will be a Commission president to be elected. And I can imagine that this will be a key issue during these peaceful conversations.
Thank you very much. Let me take a couple of raised hands. Sorry, there are so many questions. We're not going to get to them all. But Boyan Tanev, I've opened your mic. If you could be brief, please. Boyan, are you there? Okay, let me move to Marius. Hang on a minute. Marius Wegner, are you there? No, we seem to have lots of people raising hands and now not there. They have been raised for a wee while, so it could be that that was the problem. John Palmer, are you there?
Yes, I am. Marius is...
Marius. Hello, Marius. Over to you.
Hello. Already. My question is, the reform of EU is not small reform. It's a big, huge... It's a huge big bang reform. That's the image of this reform is a little bit too small for me. But to success of the reform, two things are necessary.
Sorry, I'm hearing you very badly here. What is too small for you?
For me, is necessary for success of the these.
No, we lost him.
Sorry, we're having terrible trouble with the sound on this. I'm afraid I'm going to have to move on. Marius, if you want to write a quick comment in the Q&A box, please do. John Palmer.
Yes, very much. My question stems from something that Jacques Delors told me many years ago when he was first president of the Commission. And I said, are you worried about political divisions in the member states as the process of enlargement was looming very considerably? He said, no, I think there are certain kinds of disagreements that are essential to the health of European democracy. What we need are arguments about the direction of Europe, not about whether we should be in or out. And my question, I guess, to Guy, therefore, is there any serious prospect of the major political parties, at least in the parliament, being able to articulate, if necessary, sharply different policy options for the people, for the electorate to engage with, and that would defuse the false radicalism of the Europhobes and the leaders and the rest.
Thank you, John, which goes back to this being Guy hopes a key issue in the elections. I'm going to put that question to you, Guy, and then we will come to a final. I'm very sorry, there are so many questions, I can't get to them all. Just to say, the thrust of Marius's point, I think, looking at the note he's put, is that it's just having a group of experts of France and Germany is not enough. I think there's a letter missing here, but I think he said it should have included also Poland. I think the point there being a wider perspective on this. Of course, this was not an official report. This was something the French and German governments wanted to do. Whether there should be bigger reports, I think, was the thrust of the question. Guy, on John's question about making the political arguments here, different visions of Europe, Daniela, to the status of this report, and then we'll wrap up with a final question. Guy.
Yeah, very short. There is naturally, certainly in Parliament, and that will have also be the case during the election, there will be the debate about the direction of Europe. Those who will urge for a more integration, and then you will have federalist views, unionist views, and then those who are urging and saying, yeah, we don't need more European integration. It has to be, Europe has to be what I call, we have to continue with an intergovernmental patchwork between nation states who will not give up their sovereignty, but who will voluntarily work together. So that debate we will have. What we will not have anymore, I think, that is what we got in the past, political forces who want to exit the union. Since Brexit, we are we are rid of that. Even everything far right parties in Europe, like Wilders in the Netherlands or Le Pen or so, nobody has anymore the courage and the guts to use the word exit. Brexit was so bad for the UK that nobody has the guts now to defend an exit for its own country. So I think we will have really a debate on is it a loose cooperation between member states on a voluntary basis, or is Europe going into the direction of an integrated powerhouse that can defend its interest against China, India, the US, and Russia?
Daniela, did you want to react to that before we come to a very brief wrap-up question?
I do. On the nature of the report as the result of a Franco-German working group. Yes, in composition, we were Franco-German, 6 on each side, but our working method was really trans-European and not only trans-EU, because we did involve so many decision makers, advisors, former decision makers, experts from EU countries and non-EU countries. Although they weren't permanent members of our group, they could participate in our discussions. And we actually also had written inputs from basically all over Europe. Governments came forward and said, we'd like to discuss with you. And we tried our very best to accept every offer and to reach out where we didn't get offers to talk to specific countries or, experts thereof. So as a result, I think our reflection was really trans-European. And interestingly, the dividing lines within our group were never France against Germany or anything of that kind, but a real focus on questions. We worked in couples, at least, or bigger subgroups, and we always got external perspectives. And right now, I would say the debate has developed in such a dynamic way that we are already in a trans-European discussion where this report is just one contribution and others have come up. The night we presented ours to the General Affairs Council, there was an informal dinner and a Baltic initiative involving Scandinavian think tanks led by a Lithuanian think tank was presented to the ministers, and I think that's exactly
Daniela,
right.
sorry, I'm going to have to rush you because I have promised I'll let Guy get away. I just want to apologise before we come to my very final question to Julie Gagan, who asked a question right at the beginning, but it was very specific about an initiative, her initiative called the Global Collaboration Institute. Julie put something in the Q&A box. There is a link to the work they do. Please do take a look. And apologies, Julie, you asked a question a long time ago. I just couldn't get to it because it was quite specific. Last last question to you all, and it's a question I'm asking everybody in these democracy reform conversations. And it goes back to something the late David Sassoli, the former president of the European Parliament, said at the launch of the Conference on the Future of Europe. He said, democracy has not gone out of fashion, but it must update itself in order to keep improving lives. For each of you, we've discussed a wide range of issues over the last hour. I wish we had twice as long. But Janis, I'll start with you. Daniela, I'd like to give Guy the final word for your most important priority to respond to that challenge that David Sassoli laid down of updating in order to keep improving people's lives. Your key priority, half a minute each, if you would. Janis.
I think the key priority now is to get an agreement about the next reform steps. That, I think, is the key. And that means that we need to have a discussion and then also this decision before the European Parliament elections, or what happens after the European Parliament elections. And if we don't have this decision now, I fear that we will lose a lot of time with the new leadership coming into place, with a more fragmented European Parliament, with a new commission that has to enter office. So we need a decision of what happens next before the European Parliament elections. In an ideal world, when it comes to those things that will require amendments of the treaties, Guy already said we would require a convention. I am not sure that we will get that decision even during the Belgian presidency. Okay. But we still need to have a decision of what the next steps will be if it's not a convention. And the idea of having some form of a reflection group, wise women's group, that has a strong and a concrete mandate from the European Council that is different than what we've seen in the past, a strong and a concrete mandate to work out what actually the reforms are needed in terms of treaty change, what process we should follow, and also who should lead that group. I remember when we had a discussion about the conference, the leadership question was key, and we didn't answer it the way it could have answered. So we need to have a complete agreement what the next steps are.
He's unstoppable.
Not a convention. We need probably something in between. No, because I think this is important.
Indeed it is. We're out of time, and I want to give Daniela and Guy a chance to respond as well. Daniela.
So I fully agree with Janis' claim that we need to be clear on how reforms move forward, how this all is going to pan out. But I want to add a different aspect, because you asked about, securing democracy as something that works and that gets stronger. I think we have to realize that at this point, the challenges governments are facing are simply too big for them to tackle alone. So everything I said about opening processes to citizens is a key. But the other thing is, the two, beyond institutional reform, what we are actually confronted with is A, a war on our continent, and then B, deeply transformative political agendas, energy, digital, and all of that requires a lot of money. So I do believe that we need to start thinking in a very different way about mobilization along those agendas. That means bringing in private money, but also building new kinds of partnerships that involve citizens, that involve companies, and that involve policymaking. Because I simply think we are stuck in a system where we can deplore that for 10, 15 years, things haven't moved ahead. And we know time is extremely short. So a far more flexible way to bring in stakeholders, to involve citizens, and also to make policymakers accountable for not delivering on some of the pressing challenges.
Thank you very much. And a topic we addressed in some detail in our last democracy reform conversation, and we'll come back to, I'm sure, in future ones. Guy, the final word goes to you in terms of your key
very short. In 2001, I was president of the council, and we started the convention. So I hope that the next presidency of Belgium will do the same.
Thank you very much. And apologies to the many of you who I didn't get to. We took a lot of questions, but there were just too many to deal with within the time we had available. Daniela, Guy, thank you so much for a great conversation. Janis, as always, great to have you with us. Thank you very much for joining us for this democracy reform conversation. There will be more to come, so watch out for the next one, and I do hope you'll be able to join us then. But in the meantime, thanks again and goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.